I've been thinking about something lately that keeps coming up in conversations, especially among women who feel like they're living in a world that just doesn't match their emotional frequency. There's this sense of being too much, too intense, too aware in a society that seems to operate on autopilot. And here's what's fascinating. This isn't just a personality quirk or some kind of superiority complex. There's actual neuroscience behind why some people experience emotional depth so differently from others, and it has everything to do with how certain brains are wired, particularly brains that work a little differently from what we consider typical. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine someone who describes themselves as internally focused, intensely observant, emotionally complex. They're not the stereotype you might expect, not the chaotic, bouncing off the walls type. Instead, they're the ones who overthink everything, who notice details nobody else seems to catch, who feel emotions with an intensity that can be overwhelming. And the hardest part for them isn't managing their own internal experience. It's feeling completely alienated in a world where most interactions feel superficial, where people seem to glide along the surface of life without ever diving deep. They crave authentic connection, real vulnerability, genuine emotional exchange. But everywhere they look, they encounter what feels like emotional unavailability, inconsistency, shallowness. Now, before we go any further, I want to acknowledge something important. There's a certain comic that pokes fun at this exact sentiment. The person standing in a crowd thinking they're the only truly conscious being in a sea of mindless automatons. Easy to dismiss this feeling as pure narcissism, as someone inflating their own significance while diminishing everyone else. And sure, can be part of it sometimes. But what if there's more to the story? If the disconnect these people feel isn't just psychological, but has roots in fundamental neurological differences. The reason this matters so much is because if just we write off these experiences as arrogance or self-importance, we miss an opportunity to understand something real about how different nervous systems process the world. These individuals genuinely struggle to form connections. They genuinely feel out of sync with the people around them. And if we can understand the mechanisms behind these experiences, we can actually help people navigate their relationships and their emotional lives more effectively. Dig into what's actually happening in the brain. First, we need to talk about how certain neurological differences show up differently across genders, why these experiences seem more prevalent among women. The science here is actually pretty compelling. For starters, attention differences in women are significantly underdiagnosed, and there are several reasons for this. The most obvious behavioral manifestation, the kind that typically triggers evaluation and diagnosis, is hyperactivity. When someone is disruptive, when they can't sit still, when they're bouncing around, causing problems, that's when people take notice and seek answers. Women are statistically more likely to present with the inattentive type rather than the hyperactive type. This means they simply don't pay attention in the expected ways, but they're not causing disruptions. They're just spacing out, daydreaming, mentally elsewhere. And here's where it gets really interesting from a cultural perspective. All these stereotypes that we unconsciously apply, she's spacey, she's an airhead, she's flighty. We make jokes about blonde moments, women who stare out windows and seem lost in their own worlds. We attribute these behaviors to personality, being artsy or creative or just not academically inclined. We never stop to consider that what we're seeing might actually be a neurological difference in how attention is regulated and information is processed. Countless women go through their entire childhoods and young adult years without anyone recognizing that their brain works fundamentally differently. Then there's the hormonal component, which is absolutely crucial to understanding the full picture. Diagnosis rates spike dramatically when people hit puberty, and this isn't coincidental. Hormones, specifically estrogen and progesterone, have profound effects on how these neurological differences manifest. And I'm being careful with my language here because it's not that hormones make things better or worse necessarily. They affect how symptoms present, how intensely they're experienced, and how they fluctuate over time. I've noticed in clinical practice that women often need their medication adjusted based on where they are in their monthly cycle. This isn't just anecdotal observation. There's substantial research backing this up. Women frequently receive diagnoses significantly later than men, often not until adulthood. Hormonal factors play a critical role in understanding these gender differences. When we look at what happens during puberty, the mechanisms become even clearer. Research shows that there are significant increases in certain neurotransmitter receptors in specific brain regions in response to estrogen stimulation, which naturally increases during puberty in girls. Meanwhile, boys show an overproduction of these same receptors before and during puberty, which contributes to hyperactivity symptoms. But here's the fascinating part. By adulthood, boys experience roughly a 55% reduction in receptor density. Their brains essentially calm down as they mature. Girls, on the other hand, demonstrate a later increase in receptor sensitivity directly related to rising estrogen levels during puberty. Boys start out with super high sensitivity, all that energy and impulsivity, and then their frontal lobes develop and they settle down, becoming calmer teenagers and eventually mature adults. But girls experience an increase in sensitivity when they go through puberty. This has enormous implications for how they experience emotions and process information. Now let's talk about connection and empathy, because this is where things get really interesting in terms of understanding that sense of disconnect. Empathy is often impaired when attention systems don't work typically, and we need to understand why. Empathy fundamentally means being able to feel what someone else feels. It's not just intellectual understanding or cognitive perspective taking. It's actually experiencing emotional resonance with another person's internal state. And if we break down how empathy actually works, one of the most critical components is sensory input. This makes intuitive sense, right? If I can't see your facial expressions, hear the subtle variations in your vocal tone, can't pick up on your body language and physical presence, it becomes incredibly difficult to develop empathic connection. Empathy requires that I'm actually taking in information from you, processing it, and allowing it to affect my own emotional state. Here's where the attention piece becomes crucial. People whose attention works differently often describe feeling like they're operating in their own internal universe. Their inner environment is incredibly engaging, almost overwhelmingly so. They get distracted easily because their attention keeps getting pulled in multiple directions. They start thinking about one thing then suddenly their focus has shifted somewhere completely different. This makes it genuinely challenging to form empathic connections. And for a reason as fundamental as this, they're not consistently taking in the other person's signals. They're not picking up facial cues. They're not fully present and attentive. Their filtering systems aren't working the way they do in typical brains. Instead of filtering out irrelevant information and focusing on what matters, their brains get overwhelmed with everything at once. They hyper-focus on the wrong details. So there's absolutely an attentional and sensory processing component that interferes with empathy. And when empathy is impaired, connection becomes difficult. You end up with people who desperately want deep relationships but struggle to build them because they're missing crucial information about what others are experiencing. They might interpret this as other people being shallow or unavailable. Really, the issue is that they're not fully receiving the signals others are sending. The third major piece of this puzzle relates to emotional reactivity, and this is where things connect back to hormones in important ways. We know that there are subtypes of neurological differences that specifically involve difficulty regulating emotional responses. Research shows that approximately 25% of people with attention differences also experience significant anxiety. Overlap between attention regulation and anxiety deserves serious examination because it reveals something fundamental about how these brains are wired. Mechanism involves something called synaptic gating, which is essentially about how neurons activate and communicate with each other. When someone has a neurodevelopmental difference, meaning their brain formed along a different developmental pathway, literally shapes the architecture of their neural networks. Synaptic gating refers to these patterns of neural activation. When gating doesn't work optimally, it results in anxiety because certain neurons become overactive while others remain underactive. The neurons that would typically calm anxiety responses are understimulated. The neurons that generate anxiety are overstimulated. We see this strong correlation between attention differences and anxiety, and it's not just coincidence or stress related. It's built into the fundamental wiring. Now, what does it actually mean when we talk about someone being deep? We're really talking about the volume, the intensity of their emotional experience. Being a deep person isn't quite the same as being a deep thinker, though the two often connect. Deep thinkers frequently have this existential quality to their thought processes. Emotional depth specifically refers to how intensely feelings are experienced. And here's something I've noticed. People who feel deeply often think deeply as well because they're using intellectual analysis to try to understand and navigate their intense emotional landscape. The thinking becomes a tool for managing the feeling. So are people with attention differences genuinely deeper in this emotional sense? I think there's a strong case to be made that yes, they often are. Let me break down the components. First, in brains with attention differences, emotional circuitry activates more quickly. It activates more intensely, and the emotional response lasts longer. We've already discussed how 25% of people with attention differences also experience anxiety, which is a remarkably high rate. The research on synaptic gating shows us that the way neurons are wired predisposes these individuals to more intense feeling. Depression rates are also significantly higher. All of this points to a nervous system that's more emotionally reactive across the board. Now let's specifically address the gender component, because this is where things get even more layered. Women tend to have more internalizing symptoms. What does this mean practically? It means spending more time in internal experience, more time sitting with emotions rather than immediately acting on them or expressing them outwardly. And this relates directly to depth, not just in the sense of how much emotion exists. We're talking about two different dimensions here. There's the depth itself, how far down into emotional experience someone can go, like descending into a mine shaft. But there's also the question of how much time someone spends above ground versus below ground. When you have internalizing tendencies, when you're prone to depression and intense emotional reactivity, you're spending significant time underground in that deep emotional space. Meanwhile, people with more typical neurology might spend most of their time above ground. On the surface, even if they theoretically have equal capacity for depth. And chances are they don't actually feel emotions as quickly or as intensely in the first place. Now, when I want to be careful here, because I don't think the total capacity for emotion differs dramatically between neurotypical people and those with attention differences. I haven't seen data suggesting that typical brains hurt less or can't access profound emotion. A neurotypical person can experience just as much pain or joy or love as someone with attention differences. The difference lies in frequency, average intensity, and duration. Emotional responses happen less often. When they do occur, they're typically less intense on average. They don't last as long. But the ultimate capacity, the ceiling of how much can be felt, that seems relatively equivalent. Someone says they feel disconnected from others, that others seem shallow. It's an understandable experience. Even if other people are capable of similar depth, the ability to perceive that depth in others is impaired by attention differences. It's also completely reasonable to recognize that the average person probably doesn't spend as much time in deep emotional territory. The average emotional journey probably doesn't go as far down. This isn't arrogance or narcissism. It's a legitimate observation about different patterns of emotional experience. The final piece of this puzzle comes down to estrogen itself. This explains why we're hearing these complaints more from women than men. That doesn't mean men don't experience it at all. It just seems more prevalent and more intensely felt among women. Estrogen literally provides emotional depth. The higher estrogen levels are, greater the capacity for emotional experience. Estrogen sensitizes emotional circuitry, amplifying the ability to feel. This even happens to men in certain circumstances. When men become fathers, they often experience increases in estrogen. Suddenly, they find themselves crying at children's movies, feeling tightness in their throats, accessing emotions that seemed foreign before. It's not about becoming feminized or losing masculinity. Testosterone levels remain healthy and normal, but estrogen levels increase. And this is actually adaptive and necessary when you're caring for an infant who can't communicate verbally. You need heightened emotional sensitivity. You need the volume turned way up on your ability to read and respond to subtle emotional cues. Analytical problem-solving approach that works in other contexts doesn't cut it when you're trying to understand why a baby is crying. You need access to that deeper emotional bandwidth. For women who typically have higher estrogen levels throughout their lives. This means greater baseline emotional capacity. And I would bet that the intensity of emotional depth fluctuates with the monthly hormonal cycle. Estrogen peaks, emotional depth probably peaks as well. This contributes to feeling disconnected from others, both because of the empathy challenges we discussed earlier, and because other people genuinely might not be experiencing emotions with the same frequency and intensity. They're not shallow as human beings. They have the same ultimate capacity for profound feeling, but they spend less time in deeper waters. The depths exist, but they're not visited as often or explored as thoroughly. So what do you actually do with all this information? How do you navigate the world when you feel this kind of depth and disconnection? First, practice patience. This is incredibly difficult when your brain craves immediate stimulation and quick results, when waiting feels almost physically painful. Recognize that you're going to arrive at emotional depth faster than others typically do. They can get there, but it takes them longer. Rushing them or feeling frustrated that they're not meeting you at your level immediately just creates more disconnection. Second, really pay attention to what others are communicating. This sounds counterintuitive, given that attention is the core challenge, but it's crucial. Make deliberate effort to read what people are sending, even when it's subtle, even when your mind wants to wander. Look at facial expressions. Listen to voice tone. Notice body language. Train yourself to stay present with sensory information from others, even when it's effortful. There's also a broader cultural piece we need to acknowledge. I genuinely think more people are living with less depth across the board. And this isn't just a joke or a cynical observation. There's truth to it. If we examine the influence of modern technology on human consciousness, technology pulls our attention outward, away from internal experience. Even reading a book requires active imagination, requires you to be generating internal imagery and emotional response. For most of human history, we've been somewhat internally oriented by default. We live internally. When you read, actually in your internal experience. The words on the page are just triggers for your own creative internal process. Now our attention is constantly being directed outward. We're spreading across the surface rather than going deep. We no longer have consistent access to that internal mind shaft. We don't spend time in the depths. Even when emotions get triggered, they're transient. We don't sit with them. You see something sad, a video of an injured animal, and you feel a flash of emotion. Then immediately it's on to the next thing, something funny or shocking or entertaining. We're activating emotional responses constantly, but never actually living in them, never spending sustained time in deeper emotional territory. Yes, if you're someone who experiences intense emotion, who has attention differences, especially if you're a woman with higher estrogen levels, you probably do feel things more deeply. You probably do spend more time in that underground emotional space. It's not quite as dire as feeling completely alone with no possibility of connection. You can form deep relationships. You can find people who meet you in that space. It requires being more socially attuned, which is genuinely hard given the attention challenges. You need to give people time to get where you are emotionally rather than expecting them to arrive instantly. The depths you access quickly might take them longer to reach. but they can get there. The key is understanding that this disconnect you feel isn't just in your head. It's not narcissism or delusion. There are real neurological and hormonal factors that create different patterns of emotional experience. Your perception that others operate differently isn't wrong. The mistake is assuming it means they're incapable of depth or that connection is impossible. They have capacity. They just access it differently, less frequently, less intensely. Meeting them where they are, helping them down into deeper territory gradually, being patient with the process, this is how you bridge the gap. And recognizing that modern life pulls everyone towards superficiality. That technology disperses our attention across surfaces rather than allowing us to drill down into depths. This helps contextualize why the world often feels so shallow. You're not imagining the disconnect. The differences are real, but so is the possibility of meaningful connection when you understand the mechanisms at play and adjust your approach accordingly. The depth you experience is valuable. The intensity of your emotional life is real and valid. And with patience, attention, and understanding, you can find others who are willing to dive deep with you, even if it takes them a little longer to get there. The mine shaft exists in more people than you might think. They just need a guide sometimes to find the entrance, and they need time to adjust their eyes to the darkness before they can fully appreciate what's down there in the depths with you.